The Arcade Experience by Adam Pratt was published in 2013. While it is a decade old, Adam brings up several really excellent points about the arcade industry and the media's coverage of arcade games. It's an interesting book. It made me want to look up some more information on arcades, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But for right now, let's just see what this book has to offer. Adam briefly covers the history of arcades. Mostly it covers the video game version of the arcade, which makes a lot of sense. That's the one that most people will recognize. That's what most people talk about when they refer to arcades now. But it does gloss over the history of just the amusement games that were out there. Again, it's understandable because the focus of the book is really on video games, so why talk about jukeboxes and skee ball and all of the other stuff that's been around for a very long time. Pinball is very briefly brought up, but it's not in here a lot. As I've already mentioned, it's not the focus of a book like this. The first chapter covers a wide range of topics. Nothing is really covered in depth, but there are some very interesting things brought up. This is one of the first books that I've read that really discusses the North American video game crash from an arcade perspective. It's not a big discussion, but it's there, and it's kind of cool. Most histories that I've read cover it from the home console market and generally ignore the arcades and computers. Really documenting this period, it can be very difficult because of all just the misinformation and bullshit that's out there. The internet is a wonderful place, but it seems like if anybody just says something and then yells it loud enough on the internet, it gets perceived to be the truth. It's kind of confusing at times. Arcades sit in a strange place when it comes to the North American video game crash. They'd been under attack by local governments since really the early 80s. The crash hit them, and then they weren't hit as hard as something like the home console market. They did see a dip in revenue, but you could say that was more along the lines of just arcades closing throughout the years, and also local governments doing their best to ban arcades. Adam does a good job of bringing up that companies like Atari, Sega, Namco, and Nintendo continued to release arcade games around this time. There are a bunch of other companies that did this as well, but those were the four that I remembered when I was bringing this up. Adam also mentions how the U.S. economy had been impacted, how that contributed to the North American video game crash, and he also mentions how arcades had to adapt to survive throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. The different genres of arcade games get brought up. When you get to the 1990s, it's a lot of fighting games, and that's pretty cool. Then when you get into like the late 90s and the early 2000s, you have a lot of the rhythm and music games. And then you get to really the light gun games and a bunch of other stuff. You've always had racing games in the arcades, and it's cool to read about all these different things. Adam does an excellent job of describing all this. While it is brief, I like it as, I agree with a lot of the things that he's bringing up. It's a really fun book to go through. So this is probably a good time to talk a little bit about Adam. He is an arcade owner, he's a blogger and a journalist. Few people really cover arcade games. This is part of the video game industry that just gets much less press. It's really just a lot of nostalgia-grabbing It's a lot of nostalgia-grabbing articles where somebody will declare the death of the arcades or stuff like that. It's really weird. Adam points out that the industry really does a terrible job of marketing their games, and I would agree with him. There are a lot of companies that do a terrible job of marketing their games, but arcade companies still kind of act like it's the 1970s, where they only release advertisements to the distributors. They don't really market to the players. So if you're not going to an arcade religiously, you probably won't know what games are coming out. It's kind of annoying at times. I could see how it would be frustrating for somebody who wants to play the most recent game in, let's say, the House of the Dead series, but they don't know that one is coming out until they stumble across one in the arcade. And maybe that game is just a test and it only goes to that arcade for a little while and then it never comes out to the US. It's a very weird industry to talk about. There are still publications that deal with arcades. Most of them are focused on the distributors, though. This creates a strange situation for the players that I talked about. And yeah, unless you're really going out of your way to learn about new arcade games, you're never going to find out about them. You could say this about any video game, but I think it's particularly a problem with arcades. And yeah, I like that there is a book like this to kind of shed some light on this topic, and especially since I didn't really know too much about it until I started reading this. The majority of the book is going to be focused on the modern arcades, so let's talk a little bit about the arcade experience. This section covers the majority of the book. Adam discusses arcades from a social, location, and technological standpoint, and then also brings up just how they've changed over time. For the most part, I like how Adam discusses all of these topics. Some of them I found way more interesting than others, but that happens all the time whenever you're reading a book. You'll focus on something that is interesting to you, and maybe it won't be all that interesting to someone else, or maybe it wasn't the focus that the author had in mind when they wrote this. Reading this gave me a lot of nostalgia, especially when he brought up the family entertainment centers. These places were, usually like a restaurant, a roller rink, or mini golf course, and they just happened to have arcade games. These were really the only places that I played arcade games growing up, because I did not have a dedicated arcade really anywhere that I could get to. There was one at a mall, but that mall didn't last very long after I was born. I think it got shut down in like the early 90s or something, so I only went there like maybe 2 or 3 times. The names in the places that I played will mostly mean nothing to anyone outside of the Grand Rapids, Michigan area. They're usually areas that sold pizza, they had a roller skating rink, or they had like this giant maze that you would run through and play. Or they offered some other kind of an activity like a go-kart or mini golf. There was also the big movie theater. This was a place that I loved because it had all of the really best games on it, and it was awesome. I've heard some of the locations he's mentioned in the book. He brings up one in Chicago that really always fascinated me because I couldn't remember if I had been there or not. It's just a really cool place. The reason I can't remember if I've been there is I was going to Chicago with a group of friends of mine to go see a Chemical Brothers concert. So I don't remember a whole lot besides the concert and the drive down there and the drive back home. I know we went to an arcade, but I couldn't tell you anything about really what we played or what we did when we were in there. Store numbers are brought up, which I found pretty interesting. I'm not going to really raise them here because they're all from like the early 2010s. That's when Adam did his research for this. That's really when the book was published. But I did look up the numbers for at least 2022. Those were the most recent ones that I could find. And really, I didn't notice a huge change from 2011 till 2022. It went up a little bit, but then it's kind of dropped off, mostly, I'm assuming, because of COVID-19 and that sort of thing. That probably is what caused a lot of those locations to close. There were around 6,700 arcades or places that had arcade games or could identify as an arcade. So that was kind of cool to see, knowing that there are at least arcades going around. Some of them are still attached to malls. As malls go away, then you'll probably see more arcades go away, or they'll shift into being more family entertainment centers, which, I think it's okay. Adam goes over the companies that are still making arcade games. This doesn't cover the companies releasing retro arcade games because they didn't exist at the time that this book was put out. So you don't have his opinion on Arcade 1-Up, which honestly I would be interested to know what he thinks about it. Some of them are very familiar, like Sega and Konami, while others I really hadn't heard too much about or I didn't know existed, mostly because they're in the arcade realm and I don't really pay too much attention to the arcade industry. Cabinet, controller, and gameplay design is briefly brought up. I like this, and I wish there was a bit more on it in this book. I find some of that stuff pretty interesting. Maybe I'm just weird like that, but I do find some of the cabinet design and just how you get people to really be attracted to an arcade game. I find that pretty cool. I'm kind of weird, I guess. Arcade companies have always tried new things, so you have a lot of innovation in the arcade space. Some of that makes it over to the home console. Most of it doesn't, because it's kind of hard to translate those things to a home console and then get people to buy the controllers that they would need in order to play the games the same way they would in the arcade. I really did like this book, but I wish there were some things that were expanded upon. It would be nice to hear more about running an arcade, or the advertising for arcade companies, and the publications that are still covering the arcade industry. Despite the few things that I have problems with, and they're fairly minor, I think this was a really great book. To wrap things up, Adam explains more about the media coverage of arcades. He isn't wrong when he criticizes the industry and the media. I do think many publications look at the metrics and just conclude that more people care about PC and console games than they do on arcade games, so they're not going to focus on arcades, which might be disappointing to, I'm sure, the very passionate fan base of people who like arcade games, or arcade operators like Adam, who happens to fall into both categories. Well, this is most likely true. I find it hard to believe that a few articles would hurt the gaming press. From what I know of search engine optimization, they could include a few press releases or stories about arcade games. It shouldn't be up to just bloggers to fill in the gaps for, really the games media's lack of coverage of something. But that's kind of where it is now. You just have a bunch of bloggers and YouTubers trying to pick up the slack that the game industry is just completely ignoring this. But that happens all the time. It's just one of those things that once you get into media studies, you realize that the media can't pay attention to everything, so they pick and choose it, and then they have to pay attention to their metrics, so it's rather annoying to deal with. I could go on, but I would simply just be repeating myself. This is a really fun book, and it made me do a little bit of research on the arcade industry, mostly because I wanted to at least see what the updated numbers were, and I wanted to see if anything really changed from what Adam wrote back in 2013 and 2014. Until then, if you want to know more, you can always check out Adam's blog and that sort of thing. I'll have links to his stuff and his business website in my description. I'm fairly confident I'll remember to do that, hopefully. We'll see what happens. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.